Hey all, Michael from Black Snow Comics here. Today I want to talk about the new Hellboy 2019 movie. Give you a little context first. If you don't know who I am, what Black Snow Comics is, I'm a small self-publisher of comics. And a little context is that I love Hellboy. Hellboy is my favorite comic. It's one of the only ones that I collect all of and I read regularly. I'm very familiar with the lore. You can see I just drew a Hellboy drawing a couple days ago. I'm in the middle of a Hellboy week because I was so excited about the movie. So that I was very hyped because I love the old movies. I love the comics. I read a lot of the comics. I've been rereading them lately. Did you know that Batman and Hellboy teamed up before? Who knew? I knew because I know Hellboy. So with that a little bit out of the way, let's talk about the movie. Last night I went to the first showing of it. I very rarely go to opening showings of anything, and I don't know I've ever gone to like a Thursday night showing since they started doing that. I don't really like going for the crowds and whatever reasons, and not a lot of movies get me that excited. So I came in with a lot of hope and expectations. I avoided all the critical reviews and spoilers or anything like that. I was just excited. And given that mindset, how did I like the movie? Well, it was a strange movie. It's a movie of contradictions, so this review is probably going to be a review full of contradictions. One of the things that got me really excited about the movie was Mike Mignola, the creator of Hellboy and the artist behind it and everything. He was really hyped for the movie. He was saying as much as he loved the Guillermo del Toro movies, they weren't quite representative of the comic in a lot of ways, which someone who reads the comics and loves those movies, it's definitely true. There's a very different tone. There's some very key differences. Just to give you a couple ideas, in those movies, Hellboy and his whole bureau are very secret. In the comics, everyone knows about them. In those movies, Hellboy is supposed to be in his 20s. In the comics, he's definitely like an older person. He still ages slowly, but he's not like a young person. In the movies, he's in love with Liz Sherman. In the comics, he doesn't really have a love interest. It's not really a thing for him. So let's just give you a few ideas of the differences. And even though they're very different, I still appreciate both greatly. So this movie was supposed to be a lot more based on the comics, and from the previews I saw, there's a bunch of characters that we hadn't seen before on film that are from the comics. That got me pretty excited. So how did it go as far as that? It does take a lot of things from the comics, and sort of like what the other movies, the Guillermo movies did, it mixes a lot of different elements from different stories. It follows a few stories kind of more closely, but it still takes a lot of elements and kind of mixes them around. And so in that way, it is more like the comics, but it also isn't. The tone is somewhat different. Hellboy is more of a horror comic than a superhero comic, and it does go for that element where I call it more of a horror movie. Some of the odd things that make it kind of different from the comic, the tone is kind of off, and I would say the tone was kind of off in the old movies as well, but it's off in a different way here. For one thing, they're swearing constantly in this movie, and I'm not like a big prude or anything. I took my son to the movie with me. I didn't really have a problem with him seeing all the swearing, but it was just kind of in your face and like a lot, and it got to the point where it's like they're just dropping F-bombs for no reason, and it was noticeable. The comics are not full of a bunch of swearing, and like it seemed like they just really wanted to push for this hard R. Another thing, it's very gory. The comics are not that gory. Mike Mignola likes to draw more in abstract, and it's more akin to German expressionism in film than it is realistic gore or anything like that. So that was kind of odd. The movie focuses a lot on Hellboy's father, his adopted father, Professor Broom, and in this movie he's played by Ian McShane, which is quite a departure from his portrayal in the comics. In the old movies, I believe it was John Hurt, and that was a lot more close to how he is portrayed in the comics. Any Deadwood fans will know Ian McShane as Swearinger, and he kind of has that bravado to him, and he swears a lot, and he's playing almost the same type of character here, where him and Hellboy have kind of this bombastic relationship where they're just swearing at each other and angry, and it's very different, and he's much more of like a kick-ass, let's go kill everybody type of character, whereas he was always portrayed more as like a scholarly researcher prior to this. So that, and the movie's pretty heavily focused on this relationship between them. So that is one thing that's quite different. If their goal was to make this more similar to the comics and more accurate, they definitely failed in that respect. This movie's also kind of all over the place. It pulls stuff from a lot of different Hellboy things, and it's primarily set on a story that's kind of deep in the Hellboy lore. So if you're not familiar with the stories around, I imagine this could be fairly confusing. It helps if you've read the comics or seen the other movies, I imagine. I tried to put myself in the mindset of trying to pick up all this data coming at you about this Hellboy world, and it must be, I don't know, trying to put myself in that mindset seems like I would be lost if I was watching it. As someone who loves Hellboy and is really familiar with it, I guess some of it's a little fan servicey, or just because there's cameos from a lot of iconic characters and scenes and things like that. For me, I loved it. I love seeing all these different people, even if some of them are brief. I already knew the backstory of a lot of stuff, like when it initially showed the Baba Yaga, which is this witch, and she's missing an eye. I already know that it's because Hellboy took her eye, which it does explain later, but initially you might be wondering like what's up with that. They do try to explain most of it, but there are parts where it's just kind of bizarre, and how they didn't really focus on an earlier Hellboy story, so I could see that kind of throwing people off. And since I saw the movie, I did take a look at kind of the critical response and what other people saw and thought of it, and it seems like everyone really dislikes this movie. It's got pretty bad ratings on like Rotten Tomatoes, and everyone's just kind of complaining about the movie. I could see some of the reasons why. Like I said, the plot's kind of all over the place. Some people didn't care for this actor's portrayal of Hellboy. I'm sure there's a lot of people that Ron Perlman will always be their Hellboy. I didn't really like his look because I was so used to the Ron Perlman look. It's a little off-putting just to see how they've changed it, but I think it's also smart that they changed it in some ways. You don't want it to look like it's just purely trying to mimic the old movies. You don't want people thinking it's just a copycat in that way, which wouldn't work. I did think he was pretty good at playing Hellboy, though. Hellboy is a pretty surly, kind of sassy character who, he's a grump, and he, as much as he kind of drops one-liners in the old one, that's not really how he's more of like a blue-collar type of guy, which I think this captured better. So in that way, I'll actually say I liked Hellboy's portrayal here, maybe even a little more than the old movies, and I feel it's a little more comic accurate there. Another complaint I've seen is the special effects people weren't happy with, and yeah, I mean there's a lot of fantasy characters and creatures in this, and it's clear that some of them not as much time or care was put into, and they're very CGI. But they're also shown pretty sparingly. I'd say the really bad ones. I think all the main people look good. All the main effects look good. I'm willing to overlook it a little bit too, I guess. It didn't really make me dislike the movie anymore than if they had really like gone in and made sure that those looked really, really good. I guess I'd appreciate it, but it wouldn't have made that much difference to the movie. With the plot being kind of scattershot and just a lot of stuff going on and characters coming at you, and it's just all over the place, in some ways that is kind of like a comic book, because the comics move pretty rapid fire and there's just a lot going on. There's this whole Hellboy world where people are popping in and out, and Hellboy does travel pretty much constantly, just like he does here in the movie. I didn't really mind that it was a little more spread out and it wasn't just one straight coherent narrative that just followed one thing. I like that it jumped around. It didn't really bother me at all. So if that's a problem for you, then it's going to be a problem for you. This is more akin to kind of like the Ninja Turtles, those reboots they just had. They weren't very good, but the second one was a lot better than the first one, and it felt a lot more like a Saturday morning cartoon in a lot of ways, which that's kind of how I would describe this. It feels less like a movie narrative and more like a comic narrative. So I can see how that doesn't really sit well with people. So how does it stack up to the old movies? It's not as good a movie. It's going to be hard to top the originals because we saw them first, because it had a visionary director, because it had those were pretty coherent stories, and it had a straightforward narrative, and it had a real vision. This is kind of more all over the place. I was wondering, who's it trying to serve? Why is it going for this hard R? You would think that you'd want children to and families to be able to enjoy it. You wouldn't think that this is something geared just towards adults. It's also fairly campy, which, I mean, the comics do have camp elements to them, but this one, it goes back and forth between being kind of a straightforward horror and then having these kind of more camp elements and playing them up. The comic doesn't usually play them up as camp. They just kind of exist there. And I wouldn't say the comic, even though it involves things like a Nazi head in a jar working with a giant gorilla with bolts sticking out of his neck to fight Hellboy and things like that, which, I mean, yes, that's very kind of camp and pulp, but it's always presented in a way that's a little more prestigious, I suppose. This one, it felt like at times they would have rather been trying to make this more of like a 70s grindhouse type of film or something, but they never committed fully to that either. And that's where I think kind of the inconsistencies in tone lie, and that it kind of falls apart for people. So as far as being like a great movie, no, it's not a great movie. Is it a fun movie? Yeah, I think it's a lot of fun. I enjoyed it. My son enjoyed it. Everyone at the theater that I was at seemed to enjoy it. They hinted at a sequel. I don't know, with all this negativity, and we'll see if it makes any money, if there will be any sort of sequels or follow-ups. I would like to see it. As far as giving it kind of a rating, on a scale of 1 to 10, I guess I would give it about a 7.5. I thought it was pretty good, it's fun. Again, this is coming from someone very familiar with the source material that knows what's happening. I would have to watch it with someone who has no clue, and I'd be interested to get their take on it. So if you have no idea of who Hellboy is or what it is, it might not be the best introduction for you. I don't really know. But I think it's worth seeing. I think it's fun. I hope it doesn't tarnish Hellboy for a lot of people. If there could be sequels, that'd be fun. Or who knows, maybe another reboot eventually, although no one likes constant reboots and reboots that are so timely. Even though this one is a little more spread out than something like Spider-Man and it's several reboots, it still feels fairly close, just because we all know that there could have been the third movie with Ron Perlman and Guillermo. So I would still see it. It's fun. Ultimately it's probably going to be fairly forgettable, though. It's something that I think you'll enjoy, you'll have a good time, and you won't think too much about later. It's not going to have the lasting impact of the original movies. So it is what it is. See it if you want to, and let me know what you think of it.